On March 31, 1922, a mysterious killer murdered a German family of 5 and the family's maid Maria Baumgartner. To this day, the killer has never been identified. The 6 victims were Andreas Gruber, his wife Kazalia Gruber, their widowed daughter Victoria Gabriel, Victoria's children, Kazalia and Joseph, and the maid, Maria Baumgartner. They were all found struck dead with a mattock, also known as a grub axe. The perpetrators lived with the 6 corpses of their victims for 3 days. During this time, they would eat the food in the house, feed the animals on the property, and start fires in the home's fireplace. The murders are considered one of the most gruesome and puzzling unsolved crimes in German history. Prior to the Hinterkaifeck murders, there had been a number of strange occurrences on the farmstead that could have indicated that something was afoot. The year before, the family's maid had quit, with rumors spreading that she left out of fear that the house was haunted after hearing odd noises in the attic. Then, in March 1922, Andreas Gruber found a newspaper from Munich on the farmstead, one that he had no recollection of buying. At first, he believed that it may have been a mix-up on the part of the postman, but it was later revealed that no one nearby subscribed to this specific paper. Of course, there were also the footprints that Gruber found less than a week before the murders. Neighbors later recalled that Gruber had also been complaining about hearing footsteps in the attic, though when he went to investigate, he found no one. According to a school friend of the 7-year-old Kazalia Gabriel, the young girl reported that her mother Victoria had fled the farm the night before the act after a violent quarrel and only hours later had been found in the forest. Still, no one could have predicted the horrific events that would soon follow. Eventually, the Gruber family found a new maid. Maria Baumgartner arrived at the family's farm on the ill-fated day of March 31, 1922, dropped off by her sister, likely the last person to have seen the family and their new maid alive. On the afternoon of Friday the 31st of March 1922, the new maid, Maria Baumgartner, arrived at the farm. Maria's sister had escorted her there and left the farm after a short stay. She was most likely the last person to see the inhabitants alive. Maria Baumgartner had only worked for 1 day before the murders. It appears that in the late evening, Victoria Gabriel, her 7-year-old daughter Kazalia, and her parents Andreas and Kazalia, were lured to the family barn through the stable, where they were murdered, one at a time. The perpetrators used a mattock belonging to the family farm and killed the family with blows to the head. The perpetrators then moved into the living quarters, where, with the same murder weapon, they killed Joseph, sleeping in his bassinet, and Baumgartner, in her bedchamber. That very evening, the members of the Gruber family and Maria Baumgartner would be murdered, but it was days before this horrific scene was discovered. The next day, a couple of locals stopped by the Hinterkaifeck farm but did not find it overly suspicious that the family did not answer. They had a reputation for keeping to themselves. Days passed. Mail continued to pile up. Alarmingly, young Kazalia Gabriel had failed to show up for school, with no excuse from her parents. The family, who would normally be found at church every Sunday, also failed to show up for worship. Eventually, word began to spread, and on April 4, according to an archived post from the German site Donaukurier, a neighbor by the name of Lorenz Schlittenbauer arrived at the property along with 2 other men to look for the Grubers. They, like previous visitors, found the farm eerily quiet and seemingly devoid of life. This latter suspicion would ultimately be confirmed when the men came to the stable to discover 4 bodies dead in the hay. They quickly realized that the bodies had belonged to Andreas Gruber, his wife Kazalia, his daughter Victoria Gabriel, and the 7-year-old Kazalia Gabriel. Soon enough, they found the bodies of Maria Baumgartner and the family's youngest member, Joseph, inside the house. The men alerted local police, and though the investigation brought several disturbing key details to light, police were never able to capture, or even identify, the killer. Inspector Georg Reingruber and his department investigated the killings. Initial investigations were hampered by the number of people who had interacted with the crime scene, moved bodies and items around, and even cooked and eaten meals in the kitchen. The day after the discovery of the bodies, court physician Johann Baptist Ammeler performed autopsies in the barn. It was established that a mattock was the most likely murder weapon, although the weapon itself was not found at the scene. Evidence showed that the younger Kazalia had been alive for several hours after the assault. She had torn her hair out in tufts while lying in the straw. The skulls of the victims were removed and sent to Munich for further examination. In the inspection record of the court commission, it was noted that the victims were probably drawn to the barn by restlessness in the stable resulting in noises from the animals. A later attempt, however, revealed that at least human screams from the barn could not be heard in the living area. On the night after the crime, 3 days before the bodies were discovered, the artisan Michael Plockel happened to pass by Hinterkaifeck. He observed that the oven had been heated by someone. That person had approached him with a lantern and blinded him, whereupon he hastily continued on his way. Plockel also noticed that the smoke from the fireplace had a revolting smell. This incident was not followed up and no investigation was conducted to determine what had been burned that night in the oven. On the 1st of April at 3 a.m., the farmer and butcher, Simon Rieslander, on his way home near Brunnen, saw two mysterious figures at the edge of the forest. When the strangers saw him, they turned around so that their faces could not be seen. Later, when he heard of the murders in Hinterkaifeck, he thought it possible that the strangers might be involved. In the middle of May 1927, a stranger was said to have stopped a resident of Weidhofen at midnight, asking him questions about the murder before shouting that he was the murderer and then running into the woods. The stranger was never identified. Investigators initially believed the motive for the murders may have been a robbery gone awry, but there were a number of things that hampered the investigation from the onset. Firstly, several people had tampered with the crime scene, moving the bodies and even going as far as to cook in the home's kitchen. Secondly, the crime scene itself didn't offer any clues as to a true motive. The robbery theory was thrown out when police discovered a decent amount of money in the home still, and it was clear that whoever the murderer had been, they had stayed on the farm for several days. The animals were still being fed, and the family's food had been eaten. Per a report from the German site Augsburger Allgemeine, police at the time also failed to secure any fingerprints from the crime scene. The farmstead itself was also razed shortly after the murders, making it near impossible to find any usable DNA evidence from the crime. Carl Gabriel. Carl Gabriel was the husband of widowed Victoria Gabriel. He had reportedly been killed in December 1914, during the First World War, by a shell attack in Arras, France, but his body had never been recovered. After the murders, people began to speculate about whether he had in fact died in the war. Victoria had conceived and given birth to her son Joseph in her husband's absence. The boy was rumored to have been the product of an incestuous relationship between Victoria and her father Andreas, which was documented in court and known in the village. Andreas was found to be raping his daughter and the town convicted them both of incest. After the end of the Second World War, war captives from the Schrobenhausen region who were released prematurely from Soviet captivity claimed that they had been sent home by a German-speaking Soviet officer who claimed to be the Hinterkaifeck murderer. However, some of the men later revised their statements, which diminishes their credibility. Many theorized that the Soviet officer in question might have been Carl Gabriel, because those who claimed to have seen Gabriel after his reported death testified that he had wanted to go to Russia. Lorenz Schlittenbauer. Shortly after the death of his first wife in 1918, Lorenz Schlittenbauer was believed to have had a relationship with Victoria Gabriel and father Joseph. Schlittenbauer came under suspicion by locals early in the investigation because of his several suspicious actions immediately after the discovery of the bodies. When Schlittenbauer and his friends arrived to investigate, they had to break a gate to enter the barn because all of the doors were locked. However, immediately after finding the 4 bodies in the barn, Schlittenbauer apparently unlocked the front door with a key and suspiciously entered the house alone. 3. A key to the house had gone missing several days before the murders, though it is also possible that Schlittenbauer, as a neighbor or as Victoria's potential lover, might have been given a key. When asked by his companions why he had gone into the house alone when it was unclear if the murderer might still be there, Schlittenbauer allegedly stated that he went to look for his son Joseph. It is known that Schlittenbauer had disturbed the bodies at the scene, thus potentially compromising the investigation. For many years after, local suspicion remained on Schlittenbauer because of his strange comments, which were seen as indicating knowledge of details that only the killer would recall. According to his information in the files for the case, local teacher Hans Eblager discovered Schlittenbauer visiting the remains of the demolished Hinterkaifeck in 1925. Upon being asked why he was there, Schlittenbauer stated that the perpetrator's attempt to bury the family's remains in the barn had been hindered by the frozen ground. This was seen as evidence that Schlittenbauer had intimate knowledge of the conditions of the ground at the time of the murders, although being a neighbor and familiar with the local land, he may have been making an educated guess. Another speculation was that Schlittenbauer murdered the family after Victoria demanded financial support for young Joseph. Before his death in 1941, Schlittenbauer conducted and won several civil claims for slander against persons who described him as the murderer of Hinterkaifeck. Gump brothers. Adolf Gump was listed as a suspect as early as the 9th of April due to his connections to the Freikorps Oberland. As a Freikorps member, Gump was said to have participated in the murder of 9 farmers in Upper Silesia during the fight against the 1921 Polish uprising in the region. He had a warrant for his arrest issued by the District Court of Oppel. In 1951, prosecutor Andreas Popp investigated brothers Adolf and Anton Gump about the murders at Hinterkaifeck. Their sister, Crescentia Mayer, claimed on her deathbed that Adolf and Anton had committed the murders. As a result, Anton Gump was remanded to police custody, but Adolf had already died in 1944. After a short time, however, Anton was dismissed again, and in 1954, the case against him was finally discontinued because he could not be proven to have participated in the crime. Carl S. and Andreas S. In 1971, a woman named Therese T. wrote a letter citing an event in her youth. At the age of 12, she witnessed her mother receiving a visit from the mother of the brothers Carl and Andreas S. The woman claimed that her sons from Saddleburg were the 2 murderers of Hinterkaifeck. The mother said, Andreas regretted that he lost his penknife in the course of the conversation. In fact, when the farm was demolished in 1923, a pocket knife was found that could not be clearly assigned to anyone. However, the knife could have easily belonged to one of the murder victims. This track was followed without result. Crescens Rieger, the former maid of Hinterkaifeck, was certain she had already seen the penknife in the yard during her service. Peter Weber. Peter Weber was named a suspect by Joseph Betts. The two worked together in the winter of 1919–1920 as laborers and they shared a room. According to Betts, Weber spoke of a remote farm, Hinterkaifeck. Weber knew that only one old couple lived there with their daughter and her 2 children. It is likely he knew about the incest between Gruber and his daughter. Betts testified in a hearing that Weber had suggested killing the old man to get the family's money. When Betts did not respond to the offer, Weber stopped talking about it. Bickler brothers and Georg Siegel, the former maid, Crescens Rieger, worked from November 1920 to about September 1921 at Hinterkaifeck. She suspected the brothers Anton and Karl Bickler to have committed the murders. Anton Bickler had helped with the potato harvest at Hinterkaifeck and therefore knew the premises. Rieger said Bickler talked to her often about the Gruber and Gabriel family. Anton reportedly suggested that the family ought to be dead. The maid also emphasized in her interrogation that the farm dog, who barked at everyone, never barked at Anton. 3. In addition, she reported speaking with a stranger through her window at night. The maid believed that it was Karl Bickler, the brother of Anton. She thought that Anton and Karl Bickler could have committed the murder together with Georg Siegel, who had worked at Hinterkaifeck and knew of the family fortune. Supposedly, Siegel had broken into the home in November 1920 and stolen a number of items, though he denied it. He did state that he had carved the handle of the murder weapon when he was working at Hinterkaifeck and knew that the tool would have been kept in the barn passage. Thaler brothers. The Thaler brothers were also suspected, according to a statement by the former maid, Crescens Rieger. The brothers had already committed several minor burglaries in the area before the crime. Rieger said that Joseph Thaler stood at her window at night and asked her questions about the family, but she did not answer. In conversation, Joseph Thaler claimed to know which family member was sleeping in which room and stated that they had a lot of money. During their conversation, Rieger noted that there was another person nearby. According to her statement, Joseph Thaler and the stranger had looked at the machine house and turned their eyes upwards. Paul Muller. Author Bill James, in his book, The Man from the Train, alleges that a man known as Paul Muller, a German migrant, may have been responsible for the murders. Muller was the only suspect in the 1898 murder of a Massachusetts family, and James believes Muller killed dozens of victims based on research in American newspaper archives. The Hinterkaifeck murders bear some similarities to Mueller's suspected crimes in the United States, including the slaughter of an entire family in their isolated home, use of the blunt edge of a farm tool as a weapon, a pickaxe moving and stacking bodies of the victims, and the apparent absence of robbery as a motive. James suspects that Muller, described as a German immigrant in contemporary media, might have departed the U.S. for his homeland by 1912 after private investigators and journalists began to notice and publicize patterns in family murders across state lines. Even after 100 years of analysis, and worldwide attention, little is known about the Hinterkaifeck murders, in terms of motive at least. Technical college students from the Police University of Applied Sciences in Fürstenfeldbruck conducted an analysis of the crime in 2007, ultimately drawing the conclusion that the crime was triggered by a personal, emotional conflict.